This is forensics revision. Forensics is on paper 3, with issues and debates, eating behaviours and relationships. If we look at the advanced information, we need to be aware of offender profiling, including the top-down approach, organised and disorganised types of offender, the bottom-up approach, including investigative psychology and geographical profiling, and then the psychological explanations of offending behaviour. So we've got Eysenck's theory, cognitive explanations, which includes moral reasoning and cognitive distortions, including hostile attribution bias and minimalisation. And then we have differential association theory and psychodynamic explanations. So we'll start with offender profiling. We're looking at the top-down approach first, with organised and disorganised types of offender. The top-down approach was developed by the FBI in the 1970s, and they gathered interviews from 36 sexually motivated murderers, including Ted Bundy and Charles Manson. They concluded that the data could be categorised into organised and disorganised crimes or murders. Offender profilers who use the top-down method will collect data about a murder, so the characteristics of the murderer, the crime scene, and decide which category it fits in. So we have two categories, organised and disorganised. So organised, you would see evidence of having planned the crime in advance. The victim would be deliberately targeted, so they would have a type of victim. There'd be high control during the crime. They'd leave few clues, so it'd be quite a clean crime scene. The individual would have above average intelligence. They are often in a skilled professional occupation, and they are socially and sexually competent, so they might be in relationships or may even be married with children. Then you have a disorganised offender. These offenders show little evidence of planning. Offences are likely to be spontaneous, spur-of-the-moment acts. The body is usually still at the scene or easy to find. They tend to have a lower than average IQ, have unskilled work or be unemployed, have a history of sexual dysfunction and failed relationships, and live alone, relatively close to where the offence took place. There's 4 stages of constructing this profile. So you've got data assimilation, where you review the evidence such as the crime scene photographs, pathology reports, witness reports, etc., and gather all of that data. Then what you would do is you would classify the crime scene as either organised or disorganised. You would reconstruct the crime and come up with hypotheses in terms of sequence, events, behaviour of the victim, and then generate a profile. And the hypotheses would be related to the offender. So, for example, their background, their physical characteristics, and their behaviour. Then we have evaluation. So, strength. There's support for a distinct organised category of offender. So, Cantor conducted analysis of 100 US murders committed by different serial killers, and use smaller space analysis where they identify correlations across samples of behaviour, and they use this to assess the co-occurrence of 39 aspects of serial killings, so things such as whether there was torture or restraint, whether there was an attempt to conceal the body, the form of murder weapon, and the cause of death. And through this analysis, they found that there does seem to be a set of features that link to serial killings, and they match this idea of organised offenders. So it suggests that the idea of having different types of offenders, so organised and disorganised, there's some support for this idea of an organised offender. Second strength, so the approach can be applied to other crimes. So other psychologists have reported that top-down profiling has been applied to burglary, and it's led to an 85% rise in solved cases in 3 US states. So they still use the same ideas and they look for organised and disorganised, but they add 2 new categories: interpersonal, so the offender knows their victim and steals something of significance, and opportunistic, which is a generally inexperienced young offender. So it suggests that top-down profiling has wider application than just murders. It can actually be used to identify individuals with regards to other crimes. Then we have a limitation, so there's issues with the evidence in which the theory is based. So FBI profiling was developed in interviews with 36 murderers in the US, 25 were serial killers, 11 were single or double murderers, and at the end of the process, 24 of the individuals were classed as organised and 12 as disorganised. So Kanter's argued that the sample was poor, the agents didn't select random individuals, they didn't even use a large sample, and the sample didn't include different kinds of offender. Also, there was no standard set of questions, so each interview was different, so you can't really compare them. So it suggests that top-down profiling doesn't have a scientific basis. Then we've got bottom-up. So bottom-up is a little bit different to top-down. So top-down, you're using data from the crime scene to generate a profile, but the bottom-up is a little bit different. It's an attempt to generate a picture of the offender and their characteristics through a systematic analysis of evidence at the crime scene. So it uses investigative psychology, which is applying a statistical procedure alongside psychological theory to analyse the crime scene evidence in more detail. They're looking to establish patterns of behaviour that occur or coexist across crime scenes, and this is to develop a statistical database which is a baseline for comparison of different offences. They look for specific details of an offence and they match them against the database to reveal important details about the offender, such as their personal history, family background, etc. And this also determines whether a series of offences are linked and likely committed by the same person. So we have interpersonal coherence, which is a part of this, and this is the way the offender behaves at the scene, including how they interact with the victim. This might reflect their behaviour in more everyday situations. So it's looking at that crime scene in more detail than the top-down approach, and it's looking at that interaction between the offender and their victim, whereas the top-down approach doesn't really look at that in much detail. Then another aspect of this is geographical profiling, and this uses information about the location of crime scenes to infer the home or operational base of an offender, so that it's known as crime mapping, and it's based on this idea of spatial consistency, so the idea that people commit crimes within a limited geographical space. The assumption is that serial offenders will restrict their work to geographical areas that they're familiar with, so understanding the pattern of their behaviour provides us with a centre of gravity which is likely to include their base, which is often the middle of the spatial pattern. And this is linked to Kanter's circle theory. Circle theory says that there's two different patterns of offending. There's the marauder, who operates in close proximity to their home base, and the commuter, who is likely to travel a distance away from their usual residence to commit the crime. Using this spatial decision making can give us an idea of the nature of the offence, so whether it was planned or opportunistic, as well as other important factors of the offender, such as mental maps, mode of transport, employment status, approximate age. All of this links to forensic awareness, which describes the individuals who have been the subject of police interrogation before. Their behaviour may show how mindful they are in covering their tracks. So if we look at the patterns of offending, that can make us aware of whether someone has committed an offence before, especially if we're looking at where they're acting and how they interact with their victims. Okay, so for that one, the advanced information is One key term that's in there is investigative psychology, so make sure you're aware of what investigative psychology is. And we've got evaluation of the bottom-up approach. So, the approach is practical. So Cantor and Heritage conducted an analysis of 66 sexual assault cases. They examined the data using smallest space analysis. Several behaviours were identified as common in different samples of behaviour, such as the use of impersonal language and lack of reaction to the victim. Each individual displayed a characteristic pattern of such behaviours, and this can establish whether 2 or more offences were committed by the same person. And this supports the idea that people are consistent in their behaviours. So they found with sexual assault cases that there were similar behaviours happening, and these behaviours were a use of impersonal language and a lack of reaction to the victim. So you can see that these patterns are something that's consistent across a specific type of crime. Another strength, we have evidence to support geographical profiling. So we have another study that Cantor conducted, and this looked at information from 120 murder cases involving serial killers in the US. They used smaller space analysis again, and this revealed spatial consistencies in the behaviour of killers. The location of each body dispersal site created a centre of gravity, and the base was often located at the centre of the pattern. So it was more noticeable for offenders who travelled short distances, marauders, and it supports the idea that we can use geographical profiling to identify an offender, because we've seen evidence of geographical patterns in crimes that have already been committed. Then we have a limitation. So geographical profiling may not be sufficient on its own. The success of geographical profiling, may be reliant on the quality of data the police can provide. So if we don't get good quality data, then geographical profiling may be difficult, and we might need to use other investigative techniques to help us identify an offender. This could be because recording crimes isn't always accurate. It varies between police forces. 75% of crimes are not even reported to the police in the first place, so especially if you're looking at something like sexual assault cases, some of these might not have even been reported to the police, or burglaries might not have been reported to the police, and this means that you can't establish those patterns because there are gaps in the data. So also other factors are important when we're creating a profile, such as the timing of the offence, the age and experience of the offender. So geographical profiling might not always lead to the successful capture of an offender. There's more to it than just using geographical profiling. You need to combine lots of other investigative techniques alongside this. So for offender profiling, make sure you're aware of the top-down approach. Key terms that are mentioned here, so organised and disorganised types of offender, make sure you know the difference between the two and the features of each. Then the bottom-up approach, make sure you know what investigative psychology is and what geographical profiling is, and some of the key features of geographical profiling, such as marauders and commuters.